Welcome to Dungeon Academics. My name is Thomas and I will be your instructor. This video I'd like to talk a bit about dice mechanics, specifically a rule called roll with emphasis and a roll with priority. Dice mechanics are really one of the bits of the game that interest me the most. Across all roleplay games, you use dice to generate random events, or if not random, at least events within a range of probabilities. And doing more with your dice is a great way to make a game more interesting for the players. The challenge is to balance the amount of mathematics players have to do with the amount of fun they have and the amount of decision making they get to engage in. Roll with emphasis is a particularly interesting point at the moment because we have Critical Role Campaign Season 4 starting soon with Brennan Lee Mulligan acting as the Dungeon Master. And a few years ago, he introduced a new mechanic in his own games called Roll with Emphasis. So, as a quick introduction, what is rolling with emphasis? It's a mechanic that a Dungeon Master can use in high-stakes situations where things are either going to go very well or very poorly for a player based on their decision. If a player does not already have advantage or disadvantage on a check, and there is a high likelihood that the result will either go very well or very poorly, the Dungeon Master can ask them to roll with emphasis. What you do is you roll 2d20 and you pick the one that's furthest away from 10, re-rolling in the case of a tie. What this means is that your distribution of results is going to be skewed towards very high or very low results. This ever so slightly favours the player, simply because there are more results above 10 than below 10. The mean score on a d20 is 10.5. And this means that if you roll a 20, you're 10 above a 10, but if you roll a 1, you're only 9 above a 10. There's slightly more higher results than lower results. So rolling with emphasis does skewer in the player's favour ever so slightly, but I don't believe it's statistically significant at this point. What you do get, though, is much more very high or very low results. And that brings in another mechanic with Dungeons and Dragons, which is often not used. This is not a very standard core mechanic. Dungeons and Dragons is primarily a game of binary success or failure. When you make a skill check, you either pass it or you fail it. Degrees of success is a term that indicates whether a Dungeon Master is going to allow a very high roll to be a better success or a very low roll to be a worse failure. This is not always used. In combat, almost everything is either a hit or a miss, with the notable exception of a critical hit. In almost all other main mechanics for Dungeons and Dragons, everything is either a pass or a fail, with the exception of death saves. Rolling a natural 20 or a natural 1 on your death save has additional implications. Now, there are additional rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide and external mechanics that suggest that players that pass a skill check by a certain amount could be rewarded with a slightly better result, and players that fail a skill check by more than a certain amount should perhaps face more repercussions of their failures. These are additional rules, and I think most players and Dungeon Masters unofficially take them on, even if it's never really described. If you're making a stealth check and you roll particularly high, then you can get away with more stuff while stealth than if you only just passed it. On the other hand, if you fail a stealth check by a couple of points, you might get some additional suspicion in your direction. If you fail a stealth check by a lot, that normally indicates that someone has spotted you right away. So even if we don't use the term degrees of success, and we've never specifically mentioned talking about it, we kind of have this idea baked into our game already. And rolling with emphasis is great for this because you are much more likely to either pass or fail your check by a larger margin when you roll with emphasis. The thing that I really love about rolling with emphasis is that it adds an additional mechanic to the game using standard dice that does not require a significant slowdown in gameplay or an additional load of mathematics for the players or dungeon master to work out. Sure, you have to count which is closer to 10. I think most players can do this fairly intuitively. If you roll a 5 and a 13, you're not having to do any calculations to know that the 5 is further away from 10 than 13 is. And despite being an incredible numbers nerd and a maths teacher, I'm a fan of reducing the mathematical load on players and dungeon masters in the game. So rolling with emphasis is great for this. It's an additional rule, it's quick, it's smart, and it has a meaningful effect on the gameplay. So it's a perfect rule. One of the things that 5th edition got really, really right is the advantage and disadvantage rule. If you look at previous versions of Dungeons & Dragons, you could spend quite an amount of time calculating all the different modifiers that would apply to a dice roll. And it encouraged players to find ways to incorporate as many of these positive modifiers or mitigate as many of the negative modifiers to make their skill check more successful. With advantage and disadvantage, it's very easy. If you have anything that could positively impact the roll, you get to roll 2 dice and pick the highest. On the other hand, if there's things that would negatively impact your skill check, you roll 2 dice and pick the lowest. And if you have any combination of both, they cancel out. And there's no, oh, I've got triple advantage but 1 disadvantage, so does that mean I still get advantage? No. If there's any source of advantage and disadvantage, they all cancel each other out and the roll is flat. This perhaps loses a degree of gameplay richness, but it sacrifices that for ease of gameplay, reduction in mathematics, and a fast and efficient system. And I think that sacrifice is well worth paying in the context of Dungeons & Dragons. That was a good choice for the writers of D&D to make. That being said, there are things we can do to tweak that system to make it better without slowing it down, without adding additional mathematical burden, and still giving high stakes experiences to our players. Rolling with emphasis is a great example of that. But I'd like to introduce another idea that I've called roll with priority. Now, I have no idea if hundreds of tables are using this idea already. I haven't heard it discussed before, and a very brief search didn't find anything about it. So if other people are already doing this, let me know what you're calling it and how long you've been doing it and whether you've had good results. But for me right now, I'm going to call it roll with priority. This is a situation where you're rolling with advantage or disadvantage. And rolling with priority just means that natural 1s and natural 20s have priority over other numbers. So if you are making an attack roll with disadvantage, and that means you roll 2 dice and you pick the lowest, if you roll a 3 and a natural 20, the natural 20 takes priority because it's a critical. So even with disadvantage, you still have that chance of getting a critical. The opposite, though, is that if you're rolling with advantage and one of the dice comes up as a natural 1, the natural 1 takes priority. So this increases the chance of 20s and 1s. And if you are using degrees of success, it increases the chance of either getting a critical success or a catastrophic failure. Now, with these rules, I will also say that you prioritize 20s over 1s. So if you roll a 1 and a 20, the 20 stands. But that could be a way of just adding a little bit of chaos and a little bit of randomness to systems with advantage or disadvantage, and when they come up quite frequently. What you'll find is that if players have advantage, things almost always go their way. The chance of getting a critical failure if you're rolling 2 d20s is 1 in 400. That's so vanishingly rare, it's not worth talking about. And on the other hand, if you're rolling with disadvantage, the chance of getting a critical hit is still 1 in 400. Using rolling with priority changes that to approximately 1 in 20 again. It's the maths is a little bit more complicated, but roughly 1 in 20 is fine, which is the same on a normal roll. So using advantage or disadvantage changes your chances of success, but if you're using roll with priority, it doesn't change your chance of getting a critical success or a critical failure. And again, very simple rule, no additional dice needed, no additional mathematics required. It just adds that high-end randomness back into otherwise predictable systems. So you should give it a try if you want and let me know what you think about it. Like I said, I do enjoy dice mechanics. I think Dungeons & Dragons is somewhat limited by its legacy in this case. Dungeons & Dragons has always been a classic polyhedral based game, with the D20 taking the centre stage from a very early point in the game's history. I think Dungeons & Dragons, for better or for worse, is going to stay as a D20 based game. I don't think it's going to end up in a game with custom dice or have a serious change in dice mechanics to a dice pool mechanic, for example. I think D20 is baked into the very essence of what Dungeons & Dragons is. So finding ways to do more with the same set of dice is a really important thing for the development of the game. How can we use the same tools that have been used in Dungeons & Dragons for 50 years to do new things? I think this is a way that we can drive game development to have interesting gameplay and interesting player opportunities within the game. Maybe it's just the dice nerd in me saying that, but I think dice are important, and I know a lot of Dungeons & Dragons players have a deep attachment to their dice. So finding out new ways to use them is always a good idea. Anyway, that's my idea for a new dice mechanic. Please let me know what you think and enjoy your next game, whatever it may be.